third graders. It's good to see you. Our next book that we're going to be reading is The Mouse and the Motorcycle by Beverly Cleary. Now, we read Ramona Quimby, age 8, by Beverly Cleary. She's a great children's author. If you're looking for something good to read, I'd suggest any of her books, really. You've got a whole bunch of Ramona Quimby's, you've got the Henry Higgins books. There are a couple of books that come after this one if you enjoy this one. But this is the story of The Mouse and the Motorcycle. Chapter 1, The New Guests. Keith, the boy in rumpled shorts and shirt, did not know he was being watched as he entered room 215 of the Mountain View Inn. Neither did his mother and father, who both looked hot and tired. They had come from Ohio, and for 5 days had driven across the plains and deserts and over the mountains to the old hotel in California foothills, 25 miles from Highway 40. The fourth person entering the room 215, may have known he was being watched, but he did not care. He was Matt, 60 if he was a day, who was at the moment the bellboy. Matt also replaced worn-out light bulbs, renewed washers and leaky faucets, carried trays for people who telephoned room service to order food and sent food sent to their rooms, and sometimes prevented children from hitting one another with croquet mallets on the lawn behind the motel. Now Matt's right shoulder sagged with the weight of one of the bags he was carrying. "Here you are, Mr. Gridley, room 215 and 216, he said, setting the smaller of the bags on a luggage rack at the foot of the double bed before he opened the door to the next room. "I expect you and Mrs. Gridley will want room 216. It's a corner room with twin beds and a private bath." He carried the heavy bags into the room next door so he could be heard opening the windows. Outside, a chipmunk chattered in a pine tree and a chickadee whistled, "Bee-bee-bee." The boy's mother looked critically around the room 215 and whispered, "I think we should drive back to the main highway. There must be a motel with a vacancy sign someplace. We just didn't look long enough." "Not another mile," answered the father. "I'm not driving another mile on a California highway on a holiday weekend. Did you see the way that truck almost forced us off the road?" "Dad, did you see those two fellows on the motorcycles?" began the boy, and stopped, realizing he should not interrupt an argument. "But this place is so old," protested the boy's mother. "We only have 3 weeks for our whole trip. We had planned on spending the 4th of July weekend in San Francisco and wanted to show Keith as much of the United States as we could." "San Francisco will have to wait, and this is part of the United States. Besides, this used to be a very fashionable hotel," said Mr. Gridley. "People came from miles around." "50 years ago," said Mrs. Gridley, "and they came by horse and buggy." The bellboy returned to room 215. "The dining room opens at 6:30, sir. There's a ping pong in the game room, TV in the lobby, croquet on the back lawn, and I'm sure you will be very comfortable." Matt, who had seen guests come and go for many years, knew that there were two kinds: those who thought that the hotel was a dreadful old barn of a place, and those who thought it was charming and quaint, so quiet and restful. "Of course we'll be comfortable," said Mr. Gridley, dropping some coins into Matt's hand for carrying the bags. "But this big old hotel is positively spooky," Mrs. Gridley made one last protest. "It's probably full of mice." Matt opened the window wide. "Mice? Oh, no, ma'am. The management wouldn't stand for mice." "I wouldn't mind a few mice," said the boy, as he looked around the room and the high ceiling and the knotty pine walls and the carpet so threadbare that many of the roses had almost entirely faded, and one chair with the antimacassar on its back, and the wash basin and towel racks in the corner of the room. "I like it here," he announced. "A whole room to myself. Usually I just get a cot in the corner of a motel room." His mother smiled, relenting. Then she turned to Matt. "I'm sorry. It's just that this is so hot crossing Nevada, and we're not used to mountain driving. Back on the highway, the traffic was bumper to bumper. I'm sure we shall be very comfortable." After Matt had gone, closing the door behind him, Mr. Gridley said, "I need a rest before dinner. 400 miles of driving in that mountain traffic. It was too much." "And if we're going to stay for a weekend, I'd better unpack," said Mrs. Gridley. "At least I have a chance to do some drip drying." It means, washing things in the sink and then just letting them dry. Alone in room 215 and unaware that he was being watched, the boy began to explore. He got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed. He leaned out the open window as far as he could and greedily inhaled deep breaths of pine-scented air. He turned the hot and cold water on and off in the wash basin and slipped one of the small bars of paper-wrapped soap into his pocket. Under the window, he discovered a knothole in the pine wall down by the floor, and squatting, poked his finger into the hole. When he felt nothing inside, he lost interest. Next, Keith opened his suitcase and took out an apple, several small cars, a sedan, a sports car, and an ambulance about 6 inches long, and a red motorcycle half the length of the cars, which he dropped on the striped bedspread before he bit into the apple. He ate the apple noisily in big chomping bites, and then laid the core on the bedside table between the lamp and the telephone. Keith began to play, running his cars up and down the bedspread, pretending the stripes on the spread were highways, and making noises with his mouth. Vroom, vroom for the sports car, whee for the ambulance, and for the motorcycle, up and down the stripes. Once Keith stopped suddenly and looked quickly around the room as if he expected to see something or someone. But when he saw nothing unusual, he returned to his cards. Vroom, vroom, bang, crash! The sports car hit the sedan and rolled over off of the highway stripe. The motorcycle came roaring to the scene of the crash. Keith, his mother called from the next room, time to get washed up for dinner. Okay, said Keith, parked his cars in a straight line on the bedside table beside the telephone, where they looked like a row of real cars, only much, much smaller. The first thing Mrs. Gridley noticed when she and Mr. Gridley came into the room was the apple core on the table. She dropped it with a thunk into the metal wastebasket beside the table as she gave several quick sniffs in the air and said, looking perplexed, I don't care what that bellboy said. I'm sure that this hotel has mice. I hope so, muttered Keith. And that begins our adventure of the mouse and the motorcycle. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you later. Love you. Bye.